do it. Everyone here, hopefully everyone's here. Hey, Amy. Hey, Yvonne. Thank you for having us again. I'm Bo. That's Amy. Above or to the side, depending on which way you're looking. We're going to post our social media handles in the chat window, so feel free to post your own, and that way we can all share among one another and find out who we are. And we'd also love to hear about where you're from, like if you're oh, hey Carola, hey Anna and Sarah. If you want to tag or do any social media stuff to do with this Zoom session, please do. The hashtags are Creative Melville and Soul Traders Podcast. So this is the third and final session. That's why Amy's crying. Her eyes are watering, not because she has allergies. It's so sad. So we've been through online presence, and we've talked a lot about marketing and community building online. Today we're going to talk about, I guess, a little bit more nitty-gritty about, and it will be focused on social media, about creating engaging imagery and content for social media. So I'm going to talk about images, and Amy's going to talk about a little bit more about content. Are you going to talk about content strategy or captions?
So I'm going to focus on captions. So that we're basically, we've got our bases covered, sort of like the images and the captions, which are the two main components. So we're going to, Bo and I have decided to focus on Instagram and Facebook, mostly Instagram today. But these kind of skills are pretty universal across social media platforms, wouldn't you say, Bo?
I reckon. I mean, look, I'm going to focus on things like light composition and color, and those things are across the board. So that goes all the way from, print publications and prints right down to, teeny tiny things that we might see on Instagram, and, there are things that work a little bit better on Instagram and in social media that, sometimes you might think work out in the real world and then they don't work in social media, but, you're
talking about pretty universal things, but they definitely apply. So let's just, before you go into your beautiful slideshow, let's just talk very briefly about what we think engagement is.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
So when we talk about engaging images and captions, like I think that word engaging, engagement is really important. So
get married. Do you want to get married to the picture?
Yes. Yeah. You want that level of commitment. It's got to be that good.
Do you want a contract?
I think basically I don't want to focus too much on the algorithm, but what it measures just in a very sort of in the simplest possible way is just the level of engagement that people have with your images and your captions on Instagram and Facebook. The aim of the game is to get people to respond, is to start conversations, is to kind of encourage activity like saving your posts, sharing them, tagging you. All those kind of activities broadly fall under this kind of umbrella term of engagement. And basically that is sort of how you play that algorithm game. But it's also, more importantly, how you make real connection with your community. So in terms of the algorithm, and in terms of real relationships and real conversations that matter, we're looking at the most engaging content, the most engaging images and captions that you can possibly get out there. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So I just thought it was important to kind of talk about what we mean by engagement.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So because most of the people who are here are already visually literate people, I'll sort of scoot through. But one of the things the reason that I wanted to talk about this stuff is because sometimes when you're looking at other people's images, you're wondering, it's good to learn to unpick and unpack those images, why you're lingering on it, why you like it so much, why it's got such a good feel. Most of the time, that the feeling that you're having about enjoying that image or being interested in some way in that image is to do with color, composition, and light. So those three things, having a look and having a little bit of language around that stuff is really important, because then we can sort of say, you know, then we can start to replicate with our own work and with our own photographs the sorts of things that we really enjoy and that we really linger on. And that's something that I think is really important. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and I'm just going to apologize in advance for the small images, but hopefully you'll still be able to get an idea of what I'm, what happened? Sorry. I'm just going to try sharing the screen again. Okay. This one. Oh, I see. Sorry. Okay. So firstly, I'm going to talk about a few things, and I mentioned in on Instagram that I'd be talking about something called Gestalt Theory. When it comes to color composition and light, all of those things are all happening together. So it's, but there'll usually be a leading sort of scenario. So that might be color, or it might be the light is amazing, or the composition might be really strong. Things like, so one of the things that I would probably say to you first would be to start looking at images that you like that have beautiful light. So say, I'm sorry that these are small, but I guess it will be good for people looking. Can you guys still see? Bring your shared window to the front.
Yeah, it's good. I can see, Bo. No.
Okay. So in this image, I would say that it's what's called soft or indirect light. So it's soft because you can't see any hard shadows, and it's also really great to, you know, for a very flattering portrait to have soft light. So, sorry. Sorry, I don't seem to be able to share it when it's in slideshow mode. So I'm just going to bring it out of there. Okay. We'll try this instead. So again, indirect light, beautiful window light is indirect usually. So that's something that people are often looking for. In this image, you know, it's a classic artist portrait, but I'm also asking the artist to turn her face toward the light, because that's what I want to see. I want to see her face. So this is an example of hard light, and we know it's hard light because I can see a really hard shadow there. It can work for a portrait, but it's also, you know, it can be very intense, so it only works in some situations. Hard light, also this, say an image like this would also have something like, you know, you'd say for color, I'd say that the colors are saturated, and I'd say that they're also harmonious because they're all coming from the same area of the color wheel, as opposed to being a bit more dynamic and oppositional. So there's no reds or pinks in this image. There's just a lot of blue. She's wearing blue, blue pool blue. So there's all that sort of color harmonies going on. This is an example of hard light also, so a way of using imagery to capture something that my friend Betty made, this beautiful doll. Hard light, but also it's got, again, I'm using colours that are the same, from the same area of the color wheel. And I'm also using something called frame within a frame, which I talked about on social media this morning. Frame within a frame it can be anything. I mean, that's a piece of cardboard that's cut out. So, you can create your own frames. If you're a maker, I would strongly consider thinking about your backgrounds and how you're going to, how you're going to show your work, right? What sort of background are you using? Because actually, people are always surprised at how much work it is to just have a nice clean background to show their work. Again, a nice clean background, and this work would, I guess, compositionally have rule of thirds, which you probably would know about. And, it also has soft light, creating some soft shadows. This is hard light, really good for architecture sometimes. And also has that sort of what I call negative space, or everyone calls it that. But it means that there's an image that's dynamic, but there's also breathing room within that image. And I think when we talk about stuff that can translate really well to social media, a little bit of breathing room is really great, because it means that when people are scrolling, they actually really enjoy pausing. That negative space helps them pause, gives their eyes a little bit of a rest, and draws attention to whatever's in the frame. This is another example of the frame within a frame. So I'm just using a doorway to frame Tom. Same here with Penny. These are all finding ways to minimize the stuff that's in the background and focus on whatever the subject is. Same again with Tila, same with my brother. That's, that's obviously just a piece of card sticky taped to a wall. This is also use of frame within a frame and color. So one of the other things in Gestalt theory is the idea of foreground, background, and the idea of similarity. So this is an image of my grandma. The crux of the image really is it's very symmetrical, but it also has this similarity that we see between the foreground and the background, so that the dress sort of and the background somehow end up in conversation with one another. This is a really important part, and you would have found this when you're taking your own photos, seeing how things that are in the foreground, things that are in the background can sometimes, it can be quite bad. People end up with things sticking out of the back of their head. So it's about sort of clearing and, and minimizing that background a bit. This is an example of when foreground and background can work or not work. So when you take a photo, it compresses what's in front of you. So my head and this wall in a photo squashed down. So it's really important to know where to move and how to move around whatever your subject is, or you'll end up like Tom. Luckily, his whole show was all about penises and vaginas, so it's totally fine. Color and symmetry are always really, it feels balanced for people to look at, and then you can throw something in that then that takes it off balance. So it's very balanced as an image with the 3 ply sheets, but then, something off balance with, I'm not going to put that person sitting forward in the middle. She's just slightly off center. Again, if you're making products, a little bit of colored cardboard can go a long way. So this is a scenario where you say that's color harmony. It's very saturated, it's very bright, but there's lots of yellow with that Bella Kelly painting on the front, and then, just to try to make, because a lot of the time with photography, you're trying to make, not everything is amazing looking to start with. So you're trying to find ways to use your framing or something to do with similarity, which is what, in the case of this is also frame within a frame. It also has negative space. So it has all these things about it to turn just looking at the cover of a book to feeling a little bit more interesting. This is also frame within a frame and color. And again, you can see I've asked someone to turn their face toward the window so that they are getting some light on their face. This is an example of something called continuity. So this would also show something called similarity, which means that we feel comfort when we see something that's a circle, and then we see another circle, and then we just know that those circles that are sitting on the edge of the frame are also full circles. And we understand that being human, that continues outside of the frame, but I don't have to show absolutely everything in my photo. I can look at, you can look at it and you know what's outside that frame.
It's also a very sexy example of a flat lay, Bo.
Oh yeah, well, and I tell you what, they're not
a flat lay.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're good. This is Stuart Scambler's work again, but this time with all the hands coming in, it creates what's called tension at the edge of the frame. And that means that we know that the arms continue and are attached to humans. So we know that innately, but I don't need to show those people to say, there's people here. I only need a small part of them. And using what's called tension at the edge of the frame means that it's not just something always sitting in the middle. So that's also something to play with. These are all examples and ideas for you to have some language around photography, so that when you're doing your own, which, hopefully you're trying and giving things a go and moving around, just to sort of, when you're looking for a way to make something more interesting, these are good techniques. Again, pretty basic, but negative space. This type of thing works really well on Instagram because it gives everyone just a little bit of breathing room, which is nice for them. Diagonal lines sit in the rule of thirds land. So that's your really classic compositional stuff. So any visual artists among us will know very clearly. But also interesting that florists use this S shape that you can see. It's sort of a backwards S. So they also use what in photography we would call a leading line, which means that your eye follows and it travels along the image until it sweeps down to the bottom. And that's actually a really, it makes us feel really calm. And it also means that people linger for longer on your images, which is really what you want, because it is that attention economy. So, having people spend a bit more time on your post means that, you're engaging them to the point where they're going to look for a little bit longer and they're going to pause. And that's really, what you can hope for. Frame within a frame can also be used for architecture. It doesn't have to be for portraits. This would be an example of rule of thirds, very obvious, but, I'm always trying to I'm just looking for ways to make the images, I don't always use rule of thirds and all of the rules are there to be broken, but they're good to, when you're first trying to do things, it's good to start putting things slightly off center and just giving that a go. This is what I'd call a leading line. So the shelves lead us from the edge of the frame toward the plant, which is the focus of the shot. And it's also framed. Diagonal line, look, that's where I'm sitting right now. That's an example. So a diagonal line gives a feeling of something a bit more dynamic happening in the frame. So it doesn't sit like a flat horizon. It gives, like a feeling of movement, which I think can be really nice and work really well. This would be an example of similarity. So I've got lots of things doubled, but they're not necessarily completely symmetrical. And also I'm flat again, to the artworks, which also makes it a lot easier to read because the perspective isn't all whacked out. This would be rule of thirds, but also color. So lots of blue, obviously, very clearly cut into thirds, and then a couple of people in red bathers gives the little bit of, the tension, the color tension that I'm sometimes looking for. And that's just a photo from my phone. They're not all fancy ones. Frame within a frame and leading lines. Again, rule of thirds. So on that bottom third, it's all pretty heavily weighted across there. Rule of thirds, same again, but you know, something is off. You know, it's not completely symmetrical. These are all leading line examples of diagonal and leading lines, which we use so that the viewer can follow those lines along. This is an example. This would have negative space, symmetry, and also the sense that, you know, that somebody is walking and, you know, there's a little bit of movement in there as well, which is nice. I've used a brick wall there as a leading line to lead us to the building, which is our subject in that shot. This is an example of continuation, because we know that the road continues. It also employs rule of thirds, but not, you know, not in such an obvious way. This is an example of diagonal line and colour discord. Shooting Rose's work from Many Peaks Assembly. Diagonal line looking for light. So you can see I'm just constantly, every time I'm walking into a situation, I'm just looking for ways to employ the frame within a frame, the figure-ground relationship, similarity, leading lines, continuation, negative space, rule of thirds, and diagonal lines. I'm just constantly...
So this is the same space again, isn't it? But
it is, yeah, same space, different.
But like that's a lot of drama there with the light.
Yeah, that's right. Much more contrast, and I haven't bothered to, you know, to bring up the shadows. I've left them really nice and dark on those two. That was fun. That was just the other day. For all the makers and all the people, you know how last week we were talking about hands and how you love photos of hands. So I pulled out these ones because I actually found, I was like, oh shit, actually you're totally right. People do love photos of hands, and I always do, you know, if people are doing things with their hands, I do shoot them. So here's Lee Mansbridge sewing, somebody who works with clay. This is
it's always also, you know, we had that discussion, I think in the first webinar about, you know, showing up in your photos and in your on your social media, and if you sort of need to like dip a toe into kind of like appearing on your feed, personally I reckon having your hands in, particularly if you're an artist and maker, is a great sort of way to approach that if you want to start.
And it also lends scale. So that's the other thing, because scale can be quite confusing in images. So especially if you have products and artwork, so putting any type of human element into the image so this would have, you know, also continuity, but yeah, just a sense of scale to create. So again, sense of scale. So adding people in, which is always really nice. This is an example of colour, where the colour, you know, plays probably the biggest part, much more than composition in a sense. And there's no doubt, you know, it doesn't really employ that much else, but it's still got beautiful light, bright colours. And this one I've left in because that is actually, I posted that like a year or two ago, and it turned out to be the most popular photo that I ever posted.
Really?
So I wondered why, and I thought about it, and I thought we might just pick it apart in this context. Everyone loves pincushion hakias. They are just amazing. So yeah, you've got a beautiful subject. That's great. I've got a diagonal line, which is the actual plant coming out of the vase. I've got a combination of contrast with the black and the metallic vase, but then I've got really soft light coming from the right, from a window. So side light is the perfect way to shoot your products or whatever you want to shoot at home.
And great if you're doing it at home, yeah.
Well, this is just literally right there, natural light, held up a piece of, you know, or lent up a piece of cardboard, and, you know, there it is. So I'll just come out from there, and I'm going to, have I stopped sharing my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So really just putting our heads around looking for ways that we can look around our world and our own studio and our own space, and thinking about employing something to make those images a little bit more interesting. And a lot of that has to do with thinking about composition, color and light, and also starting to pick apart what you personally enjoy, and saying and thinking, well, if I really enjoy those types of images, why? Because the light's a soft side light, or for whatever reason. So hopefully you can try to give it a go and just try to employ even one or two of these things, and it will elevate your work substantially. Because weirdly, a lot of people and even visual artists don't really employ this stuff when it comes to photography, but they do when it comes to their own work. So so that's a good place to start. I don't know how we're going for time, but I just wanted to also say that someone asked me a question yesterday, and they asked me if the photo and the caption always have to match. So if they want to talk about one thing, they were like, I want to talk about this thing, like this particular topic that they love, but I don't have an image to go with it. They've got a bunch of other images. So I thought maybe we could, is it okay if we just sort of jump in there?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I get asked that question a lot, and I think it comes up in our workshops, doesn't it, Bo, quite frequently. Can I just say though, we will answer questions at the end of the session. So if anything comes up for you, can you please just type it in the chat window, and we'll get to those in a minute.
We love questions.
Yeah, we love questions. So does the caption and the image have to relate? No, not at all. So you want to bring your A game to your captions and your A game to your images, and you definitely can talk about the image, or like there can be an overlap in terms of the subject of the image and what you discuss in the caption, but they absolutely don't have to relate. I mean, ideally they wouldn't be like there would be some kind of harmony between kind of the vibe of what you're talking about in the caption and the vibe of the image. But they just don't, they really, you really lock yourself down and kind of, you really stifle, I think, a lot of opportunity for expression and engagement by tying yourself to like explaining what's in the image.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you're not actually using the caption to explain an image.
Well, yeah, the term caption is actually, it's actually incorrect. You're actually, you've got an opportunity to start a conversation, or to make an observation, or to talk about whatever you want in the text, and you've got an opportunity to show an image, and they're two unique opportunities, and they can definitely be overlap. But yeah, remove that kind of obstacle, and I think you'll find it a lot easier to get that engagement. Yeah. So I'm going to give my tips for, this gives me a great segue into talking about captions. So I'm just going to go through some tips, and some of them are just basic writing stuff, and some of them are like really specific to social media. So my tips, we'll start with what should you write about. So I recommend choosing a handful, say like 5 or 6 sort of themes or subjects that you often talk about. And you can use some of the questions that we talked about in the last couple of webinars as to like what those are, and what conversations you want to have with your community. But it's important to keep it pretty tight in terms of the subjects that you talk about, just because it creates expectations in the mind of your community, sort of like, oh, Bo is great, she talks about blah, so they sort of know what to expect, and that's important because it's sort of about trust as well. It also means that you will attract more people with similar interests to you. So if you feel stuck about what those themes or those subjects might be, I'll post some questions now in the chat field. So those are, what topics could you talk about ad nauseum. Like, what could you just talk about till you're blue in the face? I'm sure everybody has them. Everyone has their sort of nerdy things that they can just go on and on about because it's coming from a place where they're so passionate about that subject. If someone was to ask your advice on a topic, what topic would that be? So what would you be considered an expert in, or what are you quite knowledgeable in? Another really interesting one to do is to go in Instagram to your explore page and look at what comes up. So this can be really revealing. So, you know, and also it's interesting to look at what your eye is drawn to in that sort of display of, say, 10 images or whatever it is. What immediately draws your eye? So is it interiors? Are you getting quotes come up? Is it, you know, clothes or makers or art or interiors? Or
you know what I get, Amy?
what do you get?
I get heaps of sharks.
Oh,
Like my whole explore page
really?
is like ocean, like hardcore free diving shark encounter pages. Anyway, I'm trying to work out how to stop having that as my explore page.
You need to widen your interest a little bit.
Yeah, I think I
do. Another thing to think about is sort of what you've been reading, watching, what you tend to look at online, you know, in terms of like what news articles you read, what blogs you look at. If you've got Pinterest, what do you pin on Pinterest? What images are you drawn to? What subjects are you drawn to there? And it's important to think about why those things interest you and unpack that a little bit. Okay, next, how do you write the damn thing? So when it comes to sitting down and writing a caption, how the hell do you start? So I think one of the most important things to do is to accept that you are, like, whatever you write first is going to be like really utter total pile of shit. Okay, so this concept comes from an amazing book, and anyone who's a writer will probably know this one. It's Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. So she talks about the stinking pile of poo first draft that writers face. The great liberating thing about accepting that, you know, whatever you get out like on the page or on the screen first is going to be total crap is that you can just let it rip. Just just start writing. Just think, okay, I'm going to write about like my couch, and just go, my couch is brown. It's great. I spend a lot of time there watching trash TV, whatever. Just let it go, and allow it to be crap, and you can move on from there. So I usually do this in my notes app on my phone. I know a lot of people find writing on their phone quite difficult. I've had a lot of practice breastfeeding 2 babies in the last few years, so I actually find that's I'm quite fast, and that I get into a good flow doing that. But I do encourage you to like have a place where you can just kind of, if something occurs to you, you can just kind of keep it there, like a list in a Word document on your computer, or like a notebook where you keep ideas when they come to you of like, that's really interesting. Like, I wonder how people feel about that subject, or I wonder if people have the same ideas as me, or like, I really want to put that idea out there. Just keep a record of it, because it means next time you feel really stuck, you can refer to that list. So in terms of like the tone and sort of style of what you write on social media, it's really interesting to think about being in a normal social situation. So like a pub or a cafe, and we're not doing that very often at the moment, but you know, we've had plenty of that. You know, and writers actually call this the pub test. So it can be really revealing to imagine like reading out your text or having that conversation in a real social context. And in particular, you know, thinking about whether what you're writing is a conversation starter, so sort of like an open kind of style, or just a statement that kind of doesn't have a person on the receiving end. You know, so that person in the pub who's just making statements about themselves. Oh, don't you know, I'm so great. I've got this amazing car or whatever, and everyone's like, yeah, whatever. You know, the difference between that and, you know, somebody asking a question or sort of inviting a conversation to happen. So yeah, it's really, the pub test is great.
I reckon people feel like a little bit insecure about what they're writing, like someone's going to criticize it somehow. And was talking to my friend yesterday about this, you know, these kind of critics and where are they, and, you know, are they in your head, and, you know, whether you're going to write something incorrectly or you're going to say the wrong thing, or you might offend somebody, or you might, you know, there's sort of, I think sometimes that tippy-toeing on eggshells, you know, if you're speaking from personal experience, nobody can say that's wrong, that's not your experience. So if your connection with your artwork or your process or the way that you do things in your studio and the things that you love and enjoy, nobody can argue those things, and nobody will argue those things. I think that's the other thing is, because Instagram's a relatively friendly space to be in. Amy and I always talk about, just giving things a go, because sometimes when you write something out and you put it out there with your image and it's out in the world, you read it and you're like, oh, there's a few typos. Well, you can edit those, but if you feel really uncomfortable about what you've written, you can just delete it. It's really not a problem. So just sort of having a bit of a go is probably, you know, one of the more, I think people just get a little bit stuck. That's all.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I reckon, you know, probably the sort of Brene Brown vulnerability kind of thing comes into this a lot. You know, about, in fact, the conversations that we should be having are the ones that do, that are important, that, you know, that promote that kind of connection, are the ones that you do feel a bit kind of like, oh, is this a bit revealing? You know, and actually sometimes it's worth pushing through that. And I'm not talking about revealing really personal stuff. I mean, some of the most revealing personally things that I've put on Instagram where I felt like, oh, I feel a little bit vulnerable sharing this, have been really mundane stuff. You know, like, you know, talking about how I was nervous about starting the podcast project because I was like, oh, who the hell will listen? And, you know, sharing that. And it's amazing how people connected with that, because it was a real honest feeling, you know. So hashtag realness, as we say in that episode of the podcast.
Yvonne, can you pick up the questions and just pop them all at the bottom? I can see one here from Gera. Oh, yeah, so, and one from Carola. So I find,
Can I read that out?
I'm just going to read it out. I find writing the hardest part, and often use just a few words, such as new work in progress, or the title of my artwork, or the exhibition that my work is in. I fear that I'm not a writer and that my text is dull. So what would you say to that, Amy?
Well, I would say, you know, well, first of all, that's a real missed opportunity for connection. You know, maybe imagine you're at, say, an opening, like an art exhibition opening, and the kind of conversations you'd have with people, like say it's your own show. What kind of conversations about that work would you have if it was hanging in a public place? Maybe that might be an interesting, like, what questions do people ask you about that work? What do they respond to? Do they respond to the colours? You know, are they drawn to the subject? Do they want to know more about how you made that artwork? Or, I mean, I think it's, you know, if you get stuck and you lack confidence, I think you've always got to flip it over and think about, like, I'm having a conversation, there's someone else on the receiving end of this information. So, you know, you've sort of got to think about honouring their attention by you know, by trying to have a conversation and reveal something a bit deeper about that artwork.
Yeah, so it's about not necessarily standing on your soapbox saying, this is it.
This is my artwork, here it is.
It's, you're already in an like a social ecosystem, and you're reaching out to, you know, various people. From Carola, use filters on Instagram to improve your photos, and improve is in air quotes. And Sarah then says, I think the Instagram format of a square poses interesting compositions and constructions, and that's true. In Instagram, you can also have 5:4 portrait. Which is,
I would always encourage the 5:4 format, the portrait, the long one.
Takes up more real estate on the page.
Just for the simple reason, that you take up more space there.
Look, with filters, some of the filters are okay, but they can get a little bit tiresome and they can be a little bit too strong. Usually, it's good to do something that might increase the contrast slightly. That tends to work on social media. A little bit of punchy contrast does help your image stand out. But I would say that any of the more sort of novelty style filters, or filters that
stay clear of those.
Yeah, I wouldn't, I'd sort of stay away from them, because they also, it's like when you look at yeah, they don't feel you often lose clarity in those images, and it also can give your feed like a quite sort of crazy higgledy-piggledy look. So I use an app called Lightroom on my phone, which it has some interesting capabilities, and means that you can just take photos off your phone. You can increase the contrast. It's free, but you need to have an Adobe account. But that's probably my biggest, if I'm not posting work images that I've gone out and shot for a client, because, probably, I don't know, 40% of the time on Instagram, I'm just using photos from my phone that I'm shooting around my house or whatever, or while I'm traveling and stuff like that. So I use Lightroom just to crop them how I want them, and just give them a little contrast kick. But that's about all.
That's a great way to start. But yeah. I think it's always, when it comes to filters, it's always better just that the image that you take in the first place is a good image, and a strong image with good light, with enough light, take the time to take a good image in the first place, and then you won't have to focus so much on post-production, would you say, Bo?
Yeah, a filter is not going to fix things. It's like an added, just using a little bit of the Lightroom tools, or even some of the tools in Instagram. They do have a contrast filter, so I would go with them. The edit tools by far over the other ones.
I'll read out this one because I think it's an interesting one. If you find, from Jane, thanks for this, if you find that the structure of your business changes as it grows, should you start a new Instagram page, or just allow for the evolution of your business? What do you think, Bo?
I've made this mistake too many times. I would say just bring your people with you on your new journey, unless you are running two very distinct businesses. Most people will just come with you on that journey. And also having to, managing two or more social media accounts, actually it's quite a lot of work. So you have to be up for that level of maintenance and constant tending to that garden. So I would say, I don't know what the businesses you're talking about are, but I would say very likely, if your people are with you, and your community on Instagram also includes your friends and all the people who come to your shows and people who support you, they're already there. So I would just continue on.
I totally 100% agree. I think so often people regret dividing their audience or starting new accounts. I think it's always better to take your community with you. So here's one more, maybe. Should we do one more question?
There's two, so let's just squeeze them in, because people have to leave. That's cool, but we are a bit over time. But yeah, so Samantha says, I like to have a closer look at the captions other people write. If certain captions grab my attention, I try to work out why that is, and then use some of the same writing devices in my own captions. Oh, that's interesting. I like that, because that's exactly what I was saying about photos,
that's
like picking apart. Why did I enjoy that?
Why are you responding to it?
Yeah,
that's a really good approach. I love that approach. Right.
So that's more a comment. So here's a question from Michaela. Are there drawbacks to having really long captions? I tend to have the opposite problem with writing sometimes, and often I have a lot to say. It's hard to tell if many people actually read them. I'm either not hitting the right conversation starter balance, or my followers are a bit shy because there's rarely more than 2 or 3 comments.
Generally, I think longer captions are better, but as long as you're always being generous with your audience, so you're always speaking with your community in mind. So it's not just a statement; it's a conversation. So you're inviting them in. Look, it's really hard to get people to comment because a lot of the time they're in that kind of passive state of just sort of observing, you know, and I think we all fall into that. One of the things that I would recommend is, you know, commenting on other people's posts. And I know it seems silly, but quite often you'll find that if you start commenting on somebody's posts, if you're interested in their work, like it's got to come from a real place, often they will reciprocate and they'll start commenting back. You know, I'm going to put these little, my little starting points in the comments field here, you know, for kind of engaging subjects and captions. And these are, you know, that I think tend to inspire action. But, you know, the other thing is that you could take Samantha's tip and, you know, look at what makes you want to join a discussion, comment on a post, what images, what captions really drive you to want to comment, and unpick what that is, and try and apply that. But I'll just read these out quickly. So you should aim to inspire. So share something you think is beautiful or interesting, to empower with a call to action, or an inspiring message, to observe what's happening around you. Is that socially or culturally? Maybe it's a seasonal shift in your part of the world. To educate if you're really knowledgeable in a certain subject, you could share some of that knowledge, or ask. So, you know, as long as it's a real question and you actually want to know the answer, I think questions are great. I use them all the time, and I genuinely do want people to answer that question. So that's a few ideas.
Yeah, and the core is that being genuine. So we've got one last question, which is a quick one before we wrap it up. And it says, is it wise to post photos of your art from some years ago that you've never showed before, but you still think it's worth doing it, but you think it's still worth doing it? Or does this mess up your timeline?
So I don't know if you mean timeline as in grid, or the kind of, or in terms of your work and your production. I think it's great to share old work, but I would always use it as a way to reflect on what you're doing now. Wouldn't you say, Bo?
Okay.
Like, you know,
from
that time, and there's a reason that I'm revisiting now because it applies to my work now, or because, you know, for whatever reason that you feel it's important to talk about.
I would 100% post it, but I also, because the thing is that everybody's work, you know, your creative output, even if it seems very diverse, there's always touchstones in every person's exploration of particular ideas that they are always drawn to. So I think that there's always going to be that. Even if you can't see the connection immediately, it's there because you made that
all your work. So
stuff now. So
I think
absolutely,
that's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and if it's interesting, and you know, maybe you never, you know, I probably wouldn't, you know, do 10 posts of 10 works that, you know, from 10 years ago, but I might think about the way that they, as you were saying, relate to something now, or that they might represent, you know, the kernel of an idea that has blossomed later or has laid dormant and then might blossom later. So I think, and that's, you know, that's the joy of creative output, is it's just lots of seeds and kernels and things blooming here and there, and sometimes waiting and sometimes not. So, oh yeah, Throwback Thursday. That's a good idea, Sam. If you post old work, people on Instagram will expect you to still make work like that. Oh, okay. So that's maybe coming from experience. That's a really good comment. And yeah, Throwback Thursday is perfect. So I would suggest having a look at that hashtag, and also it also alerts people that you're showing something that is not recent. So it makes a lot of sense. Thanks everyone. We went over time, but that's okay.
Of course.
We will see you on Instagram. We will maybe see you hopefully on Soul Traders podcast community on Facebook. Maybe we'll see you in the real world.
And do listen to our Instagram podcast. I think I shared the link last time.
Yeah.
If you find the podcast, it's called Instagram and Originality, and we discuss a lot of the same issues, don't we, Bo?
Yeah, and we've got some episodes coming up really soon that also talk about this stuff too. So we're just about to release them. So if you go onto your podcast app, whatever that is, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Pocket Casts or Overcast or whatever, or even Spotify, subscribe, and then as they come out, you'll be able to listen to them if you're not sick of us already. Thanks so much for having us, Yvonne, and Creative
Thanks
Melville.
so much to the City of Melville for organising.
Yeah, we really appreciate it. We've loved it. And thank you so much. I feel like saying namaste, but I feel like that would be really weird.
I just did it.
You did it anyway. Thanks so much, guys. And I'll hopefully see you in the real world soon.
Bye.
Bye.